Professor Daniel Robinson is on the faculty at Trinity College in Oxford, where he has lectured every year for the last 20 years. He is also an emeritus professor, university professor at Georgetown University, where he was in psychology and is perhaps the leading expert in the history and theoretical issues facing psychology. His interests are extremely broad. He's published and lectured in topics relating to the American founding, in philosophy, in the social sciences, and I may add, including Shakespeare. He is a marvelous lecturer, and as Brother Carey mentioned in his prayer, a great friend at Brigham Young University. I've had the privilege of knowing Dan now for some 25 or 30 years, and it has been a singular pleasure.
He was 11 when we met.
Professor Robinson's topic today is the founder's view of education. Professor Robinson.
It's always a great pleasure to come back to BYU, which is the scene of many wonderful memories and many very close friendships. I didn't know Cardinal George had come here. One of my very close friends is Hadley Arcus, who'll be speaking in this series next. And Hadley is a recent convert to Catholicism. He's also a very funny fellow, and he's been a lifelong friend. He had a dinner in Chicago. He was included in a dinner party hosted by Cardinal George. And at the time, Cardinal George said to Hadley that at the time we got, when the church makes converts, it usually says something like, "we got." At the time we got Father Newhouse, we thought we were going to get you too. And Hadley shot back, "I didn't know there was a group rate." So, in 1786, Thomas Jefferson is found in Paris, surrounded by an architecture and a high culture that captured his enthusiasm and addicted him to indebtedness. As his fine house would feature portraits of the great English thinkers, Newton, Locke, and Francis Bacon, so would it be furnished with crystal and decorative items inspired by the salons of Paris. His love affair with things French, I should tell you that in one letter, Adams said to him, "We're very well aware of how much you like all things French," he says, "but you've never explained to me how a nation can be governed by 20 million atheists." That's another subject, actually. His love affair with things French are a commonplace in his correspondence. Writing to Abigail Adams in 1785, and responding to her comments about London, she's in London at the time because John Adams is representing us in the court of St. James. So she writes to Jefferson about London, and Jefferson writes back, "I consider your boasts of the splendor of your city and of its superb hackney coaches as a flout. I would not give the polite, self-denying, feeling, hospitable, good-humored people of this country and their amiability in every point of view for 10 such races of rich, proud, hectoring, swearing, squibbling, carnivorous animals as those among you as those you are among now." And he says, "And that I do love these people with all my heart." He did like things French. I don't know that we describe the French quite the way he did. And as far as the English, I should think it's an apt description of Cambridge men, but with all respect, sir. But Jefferson was able to keep his judgments clear of distractions and neatly organize them into categories. So no matter how rich and affecting the culture of France, we nonetheless find Jefferson offering a different appraisal in the matter of education. Now he's writing to George Wythe, his former teacher at William and Mary, and the man who had introduced him to the best of Scottish common sense philosophy. Jefferson now offers these lines: "I think by far the most important bill in our whole code is that for the diffusion of knowledge among the people. No other sure foundation can be devised for the preservation of freedom and happiness. That the tax which will be paid for this purpose is not more than 1,000th part of what would be paid to kings, priests, and nobles, who will rise up among us if we leave the people in ignorance." A year later, Nathaniel Emmons, addressing his congregation in Franklin, Massachusetts, now paying tribute to Benjamin Franklin, who had just contributed a rich assortment of books to the parish library. Well, Emmons, a celebrated patriot in his own right, a teacher of clergymen, an effective defender of the United States as the new order of the ages, he titled his sermon "The Dignity of Man," and encouraged his audience to come to terms with the obligations arising from the powers God had conferred on all of us. Drawing attention to the relationship between forms of government and the degree to which the promise of human dignity might be realized, Emmons observes as follows: "We live under that form of government which has always been the friend of the muses, and parent and nurse of the arts. It was while Greece and Rome were free republican states that learning there sprang up and flourished and rose to its heights." But notice, it's not government on his account that guarantees such achievement. Rather, it is parents who stand as models of virtue, models of decency, on which the fate of republics depends. Children are, as he says, quote, "men in miniature." We know that every young prince is given every advantage and is schooled in all that is of value to the formation of character. The American child, on Emmons' account, should be the beneficiary of the same solicitude. In this, the principles are clear. He goes on to say, quote, "Consider the dignity of man, consider the worth of the soul, and let the ties of nature, the authority of God, and your own solemn vows engage you to bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord." This is going to be a persistent theme. This is what has John Adams contending in a way that can be easily misunderstood, that the kind of government they're bringing about will only work with a people fundamentally Christian in their character, in their confession, in their outlook. Easily misunderstood. It doesn't mean a certain orthodoxy with respect to church-going. It doesn't mean a common text. It means a set of values that were bequeathed by a Judeo-Christian tradition, emphasis on the latter. And now, yet another year later, a comparable sermon is delivered by Samuel Langdon, this one preached at Concord. Langdon was also a true patriot, a significant figure in the revolutionary cause, and one who did much to guide his fellow citizens of New Hampshire through the ratification process for the new Constitution. He was, I might add, also president of Harvard College, a position for which he had little affection. His true calling was the ministry, at a time when our own national life was shaped as much from the pulpit as from centers of education and politics. Langdon's address was titled, "The Republic of the Israelites, an Example to the American States," close quote. He chooses the Israelites, a common enough example at the time, as a people long oppressed and coming out of bondage with little means by which to give stability and promise to their lives. They had Mosaic law, and this gave them moral fortitude. And of course they had Moses, and that gave them a leader. But the burden, even on so great a man, was too much, even on Moses. What the people lacked, says Langdon, was a constitution. And in answer to Moses' needs, God sent them to the tabernacle to choose 70 men who would share the burdens of governance. Thus did they have the first Senate, and a government settled, Langdon says, quote, on Republican principles. In time, however, corruption and distraction proved the undoing of that state. So what lessons might Israel have to teach the new republic? Here's the summons issued by Langdon to his countrymen, who might also yield to corrupting influences. Langdon at Concord. I call upon you to support schools in every one of your towns, that the rising generation not grow up in ignorance. Grudge not any expense. It is a debt you owe your children, and that God to whom they belong. Will you hear me patiently a little further? I call upon you to preserve the knowledge of God in the land. If you neglect or renounce that religion taught and commanded in the Holy Scripture, then think no more of freedom, peace, or happiness. This is what Adams was getting at, you see. Now, these several exhortations, now more than 2 centuries in the past, provide me with a useful context for observations made in modern times by a most unlikely pair. One from Jürgen Habermas, the celebrated and self-proclaimed secular atheist and leading intellectual light of the European world. You are recording this, aren't you? Well, all right, I must say it anyway. As I've said in more than, well, I was giving a lecture in philosophy of mind at Oxford the day that Derrida died, or as I put it, dead under a certain set of descriptions. And I was at pains to point out that there is no metaphysical thesis so absurd that it cannot be made respectable if you say it in French. And I don't know why that is, but it's true. It's true. I want to say because it gives it, and you know what I'd end up saying? It gives it a certain élan. We just do it. You can't help it. Yeah. Well, so one member of the pair is Jürgen Habermas, the celebrated self-proclaimed secular atheist, and the other from Evelyn Waugh on the occasion of his. Now I said no coughing during my lecture. You remember I said that. No sneezing, no coughing, and no dozing. I was telling Rich, my younger granddaughter is now my height. This gets really daunting after a while. I had her in Oxford last Hillary term, and I found myself saying to her, "Don't sit up straight." You know, felt like the incredible shrinking man. You're all getting very big. Am I getting smaller? The other from Evelyn Waugh on the occasion of his conversion to Roman Catholicism. Habermas, in an essay published in 2007, this is not an historical document, and titled A Time of Transition, offers this unexpected, though entirely correct judgment, which in my experience with European thought is not a common occurrence. Quote, Christianity and nothing else is the ultimate foundation of liberty, conscience, human rights, and democracy, the very benchmarks of Western civilization. To this day, we have no other options. We continue to nourish ourselves from this source. Everything else is postmodern chatter. You'd think that someone had slipped him something. You know, his sprite had slipped his sprite with something. You students behave yourselves. I'll tell you my encounter with Sprite at this estimable institution. I hadn't heard of the stuff. And when the girl in the dining room, after telling me they didn't have Coca-Cola, I thought they had run out. I said, "It's all right, I'll have a Pepsi." Well, that's another story. It was in the fall of 1930 that Evelyn Waugh was received into the church, thereupon becoming the subject of public attention bordering on amazement. The London Mirror featured a column in which this most modern of novelists was seen as having been, quote, captivated by the ritual, close quote. Why on earth had Waugh, of all people, chosen the path to Rome? And Waugh replied, and you would have expected, given his temperament, something of a thermonuclear reply. But what came back was quite measured. Here's what he said in the newspaper. It seems to me that in the present phase of European history, the essential issue is no longer between Catholicism on the one side and Protestantism on the other, but between Christianity and chaos. Civilization is a little touch of Waugh coming in here now. Civilization, and by this I do not mean talking cinemas and tinned food, nor even surgery and hygienic houses, but the whole moral and artistic organization of Europe has not in itself the power of survival. It came into being through Christianity, and without it has no significance or power to command allegiance. Close quote. Habermas and Waugh reached the same conclusion, one reached by many observers over the long, influential course of Christianity in the West. Christianity, to be sure, was not born in an intellectual vacuum, nor was it obliged to create a philosophical foundation for itself. It had the benefit, and it made productive use of this benefit, of centuries of philosophical inquiry. In adapting the fruits of this inquiry to the new conception of human nature and the conditions required to nurture it, Christianity's major religious philosophers established both the rationale and the institutions to which both Habermas and Waugh refer. The university, of course, being one of them. The rationale and the institutions would become ever more pliant, ever more useful to those forms of civic life characteristic of what we often rather blandly refer to as the Western democracies. Here, then, are the temporal boundaries. A revolutionary period featuring the founders and their brethren, and our recent and even contemporary national life, now on the edge of losing the moral and spiritual foundations on which the great experiment in self-governance was predicated. Regarding these foundations, it's useful now for me to return to the founding generation again and the presuppositions that guided their historic undertaking. You understand how historic this was, don't you? This is the first time in the history of the world that a nation was created by persons whose names we know on a date certain in a place you can still visit. And they knew that if they were getting it wrong, they would be and should be hanged as traitors. If your schooling hasn't got a tickle up your leg over that, isn't that what's his name, every time President Obama speaks, his leg gets itchy or something? I forget his name. A tingle in your, yeah. Tingle over this, not that. So let me resume the story with two of the founding fathers, one much more known than the other, John Adams and James Wilson. First, Adams. While still young, Adams was less than fully satisfied with what he had learned at Harvard. I shan't get started on that. Especially when Adams applied for admission to Harvard, the admissions interviews were conducted in Latin. So, I mean, if he wasn't happy with it then, well, and he was particularly concerned about the education he got in the classics. At the age of 29, and with the bidding of his young colleague Benjamin Gridley, Adams joined in forming the Sodalitas Club, a short-lived club. It was intended for lawyers eager to repair their worrisome lack of classical knowledge and other things. The idea for the club was Gridley's, and the small membership began with Adams and with Samuel Fitch. All three of them had attended the famous case pleaded by James Otis in 1761 against the king's imposition of writs of assistance, a plea that dubbed such writs, quote, an instrument of slavery, and affirmed the principle of natural rights and fundamental common law precepts. So they are already present during the foment. Though short-lived, the Sodalitas Club provided the context for Adams's anonymously published, quote, August 1765, an extremely important work in colonial history, a treatise on the Puritan rejection of feudal law. The following lines are found in that essay written by Adams, August 1765. Listen to this. I always consider the settlement of America with reverence and wonder as the opening of a grand scene and design in Providence for the illumination of the ignorant and the emancipation of the slavish part of mankind all over the earth. You see, 1765, he, as with the other founders, are recognizing this isn't something local. Novus Ordo Seclorum. It's a new order of the ages, do you see? This revolution reaches what foundationally is in the very nature of human nature. It's if it's right here, it's right everywhere. Oh my goodness, that's sort of opposing hegemonically one's values on others, isn't it? We must do something about that. And we did. Emancipation of the slavish part of mankind all over the earth. Provision was early made by law that every town should be accommodated with a grammar school under a severe penalty, so that even negligence of learning was made a crime. Do you know what he's referring to? He's referring to bills passed in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in 1642 and 1647, where grammar schools had to be established and where the failure to educate children was a criminal act. It was an act of criminal negligence. Well, as for meetings of the Sodalitas Club, we know that the first of the classical treatises chosen for analysis and discussion was Cicero's famous oration, Pro Milone. An interesting choice indeed, for some 25 years later, the same oration will be featured in the 12th of James Wilson's lectures on law. You'll see how this comes together. It's a promise. In Pro Milone, Cicero prepared a defense for the famous Roman agitator Titus Annius Milo Papianus. It was Milo who had ordered his slave to murder Publius Clodius Pulcher in 53 BC. The same Milo had been one of Cicero's ardent supporters, working successfully in behalf of Cicero's return from exile. Nonetheless, when Milo was to be tried for the murder of Clodius, Cicero decided against defending him publicly. He chose instead, and after Milo's exile, to send Milo a copy of the defense he had composed that he might have delivered. You say, Camille's still practicing law? Yeah, you better, keep your eye on it. He sends him a copy. If I had decided to defend you, wait till you read this great defense, you there in exile. At the time, Milo was serving his sentence in today's Marseille. He wrote back to Cicero that had the latter actually secured his freedom, he, Milo, would not now be, quote, dining on fine red mullet. Milo is a sketch, by the way. I could tell you some things about him. It's not difficult to see what both the young John Adams and years later James Wilson, the seasoned lawyer, found in Cicero's undelivered defense. Wilson was a native Scot, a signer of both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and a truly pivotal figure in the development and ratification of the Constitution. He is important. He was appointed by President Washington to the first Supreme Court. He wrote the definitive opinion in Chisholm versus Georgia. And Wilson is consequential, really consequential. Wilson's use of Cicero's Pro Milona appears in the lecture he devotes to the concept of natural rights. Here's the key passage from Cicero. You want to listen to this, I should think. Quote, "There exists, judges, this law, which is not written, but inborn. We have not learned it, received it, or read it, but from nature herself we have snatched, imbibed, and extorted it, a law to which we are not trained, but in which we are made, in which we are not instructed, but with which we are imbued." It's probably the most trenchant statement of natural law theory that you will read. Unless it's Diopera nuerexios nous sonamos estin. Aristotle's always shorter than other people on these things. The law's reason without passion. Anuerexios. A student once said to me, does Aristotle want the law to be anorexic? Yes. If you understand the word, yes. Passionless. There's surely nothing exceptional in one of the founding fathers and among President Washington's first appointees to the Supreme Court deriving his conception of human rights from classical sources. Of course, the only way you can derive things from classical sources, guess what, is to know the sources. The modern tendency, out of a profound respect for the founders and for the Age of Enlightenment itself, tends to attribute their lofty principles and ideals to them directly. Ah, the Enlightenment, do you say? And this is a view that has been successfully challenged by scholars. Professor Gilbert Chenard, writing at Princeton, publishing in 1940, interestingly, in the very first issue of the Journal of the History of Ideas, has an article titled Polybius and the American Constitution. And he says this: the philosophy of the 18th century, the Enlightenment, the philosophy of the 18th century is still so close to us. We live in societies so deeply transformed and so completely remolded by 18th century thinkers that the natural tendency has been to attribute to English liberals and deists, to the French philosophes and the American founders, an originality which they themselves would not have claimed. Since they knew the sources, they would be plagiarizing if they said they had come up with this. And even all the attention that we give to Montesquieu is really because Montesquieu provides wonderfully dense redactions of classical thought. It's just getting to the classics by way of Montesquieu. This was all very well known to the founders. Jefferson says at one point that, this originality people are talking about, there isn't anything we've stipulated that can't be found, his examples, that can't be found in Cicero or Aristotle. Well, if this is all surprising to a contemporary audience, it surely came as no surprise to Edmund Burke. Consider these lines from his famous speech on conciliation, which he delivered to Parliament in March of 1775. He says, Permit me, sir, to add another circumstance in our colonies, which contributes no mean part toward the growth and effect of this untractable spirit. I mean their education. This study renders men acute, inquisitive, dexterous, prompt in attack, ready in defense, full of resources. In other countries, the people, more simple and of a less mercurial cast, judge of an ill principle in government only by an actual grievance. Here they anticipate the evil and judge of the pressure of the grievance by the badness of the principle. This is Burke saying that the colonists are more sophisticated in their thinking. They are more fully grounded in the arts of argument and analysis. They don't wait for some grievance to give them a bunion. They take a look at the principle that was operating at the time the bunion was formed and take out after the principle. These are first-rate minds. You don't pull this off otherwise. You don't go bang, bang with a musket and all of a sudden George III's people go home. You don't wrap your feet in cloth because you don't have shoes and follow a man who has yet to win a battle unless you think you got the principle right. Acknowledged here by Burke and defended by nothing less than the facts of history itself is the connection between, on the one hand, a mind prepared by disciplined study, and on the other hand, a mind able to anticipate consequences and form a plan of action to meet them. Simple persons are abandoned to the consequences. Their judgments are a posteriori. The instructed mind sees ahead, weighs alternatives, locates the ruling principle, and from it forges predictions and plans. This understanding was commonplace in the 18th century. It's no wonder, then, that so many of the leaders of the revolutionary cause devoted so much thought to the matter of, yes, public education. In this connection, I want to return to Adams. In the significant year 1776, delegates to the Continental Congress were encouraged to consult him on the task of creating state constitutions. He offered his advice to the delegates from North Carolina, providing them with what became one of the most notable productions of the Revolutionary period, his thoughts on government. It is significant as a treatise in political theory, but the passage most relevant to my present purpose is this one. Quote, laws for the liberal education of youth, especially of the lower class of people, are so extremely wise and useful that to a humane and generous mind, no expense for this purpose should be thought extravagant. Laws covering education for the least well off, you see. The beneficiaries of the humane and generous mind are the youth of the nation, those on whom its fortunes will soon depend. The liberating education generally available to children of privilege within the context of a settled and flourishing family life is likely to be lacking for children of the lower class of people. Adams makes clear in his thoughts on government that the right form of government and the right foundational principles are but abstractions until they are embraced by an informed and able citizenry. If any of the founders was more explicit and persistent in this than Adams, it was Jefferson. In his Notes on Virginia, 1782, Jefferson again states that the law covering public education has as its most legitimate objective, quote, rendering the people the safe as they are the ultimate guardians of their own liberty. And years later in 1810, the same theme is struck in his letter to John Tyler, Jefferson now declaring that, quote, I have indeed two great measures at heart without which no republic can maintain itself in strength. One, that of general education, to every man to judge for himself what will secure or endanger his freedom. 2, to divide every county into hundreds, of such size that all the children of each are within reach of a central school. This is Jefferson's 2 primary objectives. You begin to see why in his epitaph he does list himself as the founder of the University of Virginia, and apparently there's not enough room on the stone to mention that he also happened to be President of the United States. I want to go there, see, to a place like that. In a letter to John Adams in I'll tell you when James Wilson gives the court's opinion in Chisholm versus Georgia, he says, if you want to consult the principles that count here, I can advise no better source than the work of the estimable Dr. Reid and his inquiry into the human mind. And I've said often before, show me a Supreme Court citing Thomas Reid's inquiry into the human mind, and that's a place I'd like to live. I don't know what they cite today, Newsweek or something. In a letter to Adams in 1813, Jefferson's concerns are framed in another way, further completing his thoughts on the matter. Quote, this bill on education would raise the mass of people to the high ground of moral respectability necessary to their own safety and to orderly government. I have great hope that some patriotic spirit will call it up and make it the keystone of the arch of our government. You understand the sense in which Jefferson keeps referring to the safety of the people. It's not the safety of the people provided by a physical barrier. It's preserving the people against the art and cunning of governments that act illicitly and in manners that are oppressive. It's securing the safety of the people by making them wise. 4 years later, and recognizing that the United States was and would long continue to be a nation of immigrants, Jefferson wrote to Correia de Serra about his bill for universal education. Its aim, he says, is this, quote, to bring into action that mass of talents which lies buried in poverty in every country for want of the means of development, and thus give activity to a mass of mind which in proportion to our population shall be the double or treble of what it is in most countries. It's education that realizes our humanity, you see, the fullest realization, the flourishing of what defines us. I might note that in the same year Jefferson was writing to Correia de Serra, John Witherspoon was distributing his letters on the education of children and on marriage. I'll say a few words about Witherspoon in a moment. I mention here, but not as an aside, that Jefferson was on record as judging the 2 greatest metaphysicians of the age to be Dougal Stewart, who was Thomas Reid's friend and student, and Destutt Tracy, Destutt Leconte de Tracy, as they would say it. Stewart was a student and lifelong friend of Thomas Reid's and a defender of the Scottish Common Sense School. Destutt was one of the leading French philosophes. In 1811, Destutt published a commentary and review of Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, to which are annexed observations on the 31st book by the late Monsieur Condorcet and 2 letters of Helvetius on the merits of the same work. And who translated that into English? Jefferson. It's in Book 4 of Destutt's commentary that the author takes Montesquieu to task for asserting self-denial as the principal disposition expected of those living under republican forms of government. He rejects the proposition that a hair shirt is to be preferred to a life of happiness and comfort. And he also denies to the government the right to take children from families and arrogate to itself the task of their education. Rather, he says, quote, the only counsel that can be given to government on the subject of education is to provide such gentle means or regulation as that the 3 kinds of education which men successively receive, from their parents, from their teachers, and from intercourse with society shall be in unison with each other. What Jefferson likes about this, taking the trouble to translate the word, is the idea that the schoolroom, the classroom, is not some preserve, it's not some independent duchy put together by governments for government purposes and dragooning children out of their family life so the government can teach what the government knows best. The most the government can do is work to establish a unity, a coherence, a thematic integrity between and among the realms of education to which children are exposed. First, the family. Yes, the schoolroom. And then, yes, civic life. Do you see? What's the classical source for that? Polis, Andra, Didaska. Man is taught by the city. Do you see? The task of public education is that of harmonizing parental, educational, and social instruction in a manner required for the preservation of those principles on which a decent government depends. Jefferson knew this, and he admired the arguments that Destutt had adduced in support of it. We find in the autobiographical sketch that he composed 5 years before he died, Jefferson's reflections on the same matter expressed earlier by himself and by John Adams. Quote, "The less wealthy people, by the bill for a general education, would be qualified to understand their rights, to maintain them, and to exercise with intelligence their parts in self-government, and all this would be effected without the violation of a single natural right of any one individual citizen." You understand that the tendency today is quite in the opposite direction. It's tailoring an education to satisfy the rather local, tribal, provincial, ethnic, racial. You see this particularization of humanity into some kind of pattern of molecules, and then nurturing these enclaves in terms that are intelligible and acceptable to them. That may be a defensible position, judged to be entirely inimical to the preservation of this nation as judged by the people who made it. From these sources, and scores of others could be added to them, the following general conclusions are warranted. First, founding a republic is a serious matter that calls for prepared minds, fully conversant with historical successes and failures. Preparation for what is finally a civic life includes classical sources, if only to test the progress claimed by more recent and by contemporary commentators. Thus, if Montesquieu seems wise, and if Montesquieu must consult the ancients, then perhaps we should follow his good example and aspire to comparable wisdom, if only to test Montesquieu's own reading and conclusions. Second, the burden here is especially heavy on persons who have not had the benefit of wealth, high breeding, and rank. In a busy, complex, growing political world, it's easy to be marginalized without even knowing it. It's easier still to be manipulated and gulled. If proper measures are not taken, a class system will assert itself, and the high ideals of republicanism will then give way to the tired, dangerous, de facto tyrannies of the past. If we, the people, are the ones who constitute the United States, then the people are the government, and subject to the same moral and political appraisals brought to bear on any government. Clearly, then, not only education, but a high and disciplined form of education must be at the foundation of any republic that would recommend itself as nothing less than a republic of virtue. I hope not to be misunderstood here. The American founding was not primarily an academic exercise. The blood and bravery expended in its behalf have been comparably repaid only by succeeding generations of soldiers who have risked their lives to preserve it, and thank God for them. Nonetheless, when John Adams insisted that the American Revolution was, quote, effected before the war commenced, you see, the revolution had been accomplished before a shot was fired. It was a revolution in perspective. He was making a point often overlooked. First, there was a perspectival revolution, nothing less than what Adams referred to as, quote, a religious transformation in perspective. There was a revolution in the political and moral appraisals of a bequeathed reality that had left far too much to be desired. An angry and excited mob can stage a rebellion and be judged later as having had every right to do so. This is what Burke was getting at when he spoke of simple people who react on the basis of grievance and indignation. The American founding did not arise from the indignation of a mob, though indignation there was in abundance. It arose only when such sentiments were joined to and justified by principles judged to be universally valid. In a word, the American founding took place because there were good reasons for it. If it had failed, the reasons would have remained good, even as they remained in waiting. Jefferson again makes clear the importance of education to the least privileged, but what of the more and the most privileged? They formed a class of interest to the most renowned educator of the Revolutionary period, John Witherspoon, president of the College of New Jersey, soon to be Princeton. He played a pivotal role in the revolutionary cause. He was a signer of the Declaration and of the Constitution, a teacher of 3 justices of the Supreme Court, 10 cabinet officers, 12 members of the Continental Congress, 28 senators, 49 members of Congress, and little Jimmy Madison into the bargain. Witherspoon, we can say, was an educator. Rich, we keep on trucking, but Witherspoon was an educator. In one of his many addresses on the subject of education, Witherspoon draws attention to the special needs of the children of society's most affluent and powerful families. You see, the pincer movement. Adams and Jefferson know that it's the children of poverty who desperately need the good educational. They're the pushovers. They're the ones who can be manipulated. They're the ones most likely and most reasonably likely to respond to seductive offers and so forth. What about at the other end? And Witherspoon is addressing that. He says, regarding the children of wealth and power, of all others have the greatest need of an early, prudent, and well-conducted education. They need it most of all. The wealth to which they are born becomes often a dangerous temptation, and the station in which they enter upon life requires such duties as those of the finest talents can scarcely be supposed capable of unless they've been improved and cultivated with the utmost care. Experience shows the use of a liberal education. It is generally a preservative from vice of a certain class, inspiring the mind. Listen, this is what a liberal education does. It inspires the mind with an abhorrence of low riot and a contempt for brutal conversation. Low riot and brutal conversation. Today's mass media, today's video games, today's everything. Is there any doubt as to the aptness of Jefferson's and Witherspoon's reflections when applied to our contemporary national life? How does the educational establishment now instruct the young in the very nature of rights, their relationship to duties, their source and their limits? How does the educational establishment distinguish for the young between individuality and individualism. Of course, our national life and the wider world have changed since the founding, perhaps even beyond the imagination of our celebrated founders. The differences between now and then are so great that attempts to apply the reasoning and perspective of the late 18th century to current conditions surely will seem anachronistic. In important respects, however, the founders themselves may have regarded such criticism as misplaced. To regard as some sort of fallacy an attempt to understand the past in terms that match up with the present conditions is to assume that the human condition itself shares very little in common with itself at different times and under different conditions. Well, if this were so, history would not only fail to be a guide, it would fail even to be intelligible. In considering the history of failed republics, the founders had good reason to believe that the perils of the past were still with us, always with us. The repetition of serious blunders does not result in immunities, but in a weakening of the frame, an enlargement of the vulnerabilities themselves. Thus did they set out to create a new order, a realm of ordered liberty, respectful of the dignity of the individual, whose fundamental rights were not the gift of government in the first instance. A new order, Novus Ordo Cyclorum, a new order of the ages. The phrase reminds one, doesn't it, of the Great Seal of the United States, the motto, Novus Ordo Cyclorum. The Great Seal was designed in 1782. Lunches on me. Who designed it? Yeah, I know. By Charles Thomson, who was secretary to the Continental Congress. We should remember Charles Thomson for many reasons. We should remember Charles Thomson for many reasons. Not the least of which is this. On that historic day, July 4, 1776, the original Declaration of Independence was actually signed only by two people, Charles Thomson, in his capacity as secretary, and John Hancock, who was then president of the Congress. But Thomson deserves to be remembered for still other achievements. He was born in Ireland and arrived here impoverished as a boy with his brother, his father having died before the ship had reached port in New York. Thomson, there was a Protestant minister who took in orphans. He took in orphans, and he gave them the education that, of course, every little orphan boy from Ireland really needs. Latin and Greek. Thomson came to be known and trusted for undeviating integrity. It's how he got the job as secretary. The Indian tribe of the Delawares accepted him as a member, and they gave him the name Man of Truth. There are still other accomplishments Thomson can claim. In 1808, he published the first American translation of the oldest version of the Old Testament in 4 volumes, adding to this in the same year his translation of the New Testament. So here we have an Irish orphan with mastery of Greek, rising to the level of civic life and devotion to liberty that would have John Adams declare him to be the Sam Adams of Philadelphia. Now, what of the motto itself? Thomson took the phrase Novus Ordo Cyclorum from Virgil's 4th Eclogue, which includes the very beautiful passage, Ultima cumai venit iam carminis actas, magnus ab integro cyclorum nascitur ordo. I translate the lines thus. Now does the age of prophetic song come to its finality. Born anew is the great order of the ages. Henceforth, the world will not be as prophesied, but as made. As for the United States, what greater evidence that our lives are in our own hands than Charles Thomson's own life? The Great Seal is an echo of a classical vision that no longer accepted the past as prologue. But how is this to be understood? Surely not because human nature has metamorphosed into something other than itself. Rather, it is because the powers latent in humanity have been liberated from an oppressive and inauthentic past. It is just this understanding that gave the founders confidence that what they sought to bring about was right for human nature as such, and not merely for persons living here rather than there, or now rather than then. I return to Cicero. Of all the sources that laid claim on the acquisitive faculties of the founders, it was Cicero who had pride of place. The founders tended to think in the idiom of law, and Cicero was the great lawyer. They tended to think in civic terms, and here again Cicero was the quintessential commentator. His treatise on duties, his De Officiis, was a staple in the schools and in the domestic libraries of lawyers and farmers alike. Cicero composed the treatise in the last year of his life, and he presented it as a letter to his son. After noting the special nature bestowed on various creatures, Cicero in this work says, "Above all, the search after truth and its eager pursuit are peculiar to man." He notes the eagerness with which we approach the wonders of creation, and how such knowledge is, as he says, indispensable to a happy life. And he goes on, quote, "To this passion for discovering truth, there is added a hungering, as it were, for independence, so that a mind well molded by nature is unwilling to be subject to anybody save one who gives rules of conduct, or is a teacher of truth, or who, for the general good, rules according to justice and law. From this attitude come greatness of soul and a sense of superiority to merely worldly conditions." Well, when Tocqueville looked at us in the 19th century, he said this. He worried about our future. Looking into the future toward a new form of despotism, Tocqueville sees, quote, "an innumerable host of men, all alike and equal, endlessly hastening after petty and vulgar pleasures with which they fill their souls, each of them withdrawn into himself, virtually a stranger to the fate of all others. For him, his children and personal friends comprise the entire human race. As for the remainder of his fellow citizens, he lives alongside them, but he does not see them. He touches them, but he doesn't feel them. He exists only for himself, and if he still has a family, he no longer has a country. Over these men stands an immense tutelary power, which assumes sole responsibility for securing their pleasure and watching over their fate. It is absolute, meticulous, regular, provident, and mild. It would resemble paternal authority, if only its purpose were the same, namely to prepare men for manhood. But on the contrary, it seeks only to keep them in childhood irrevocably. It would be comforting to think that our educational institutions at every level might provide a corrective for all this. Alas, today they're but symptoms of the disease they would presume to cure. But this is not the last word. A free people may freely reinvent themselves. They may rediscover a path long neglected. They may find within themselves the resources, the willpower to abandon their distractions. Thus, once more, might the age of prophetic song come to its finality, and the great order of the ages may yet be born again.